How's it going, everyone? We are going to be talking about how political views can be graphically visualized on a plot, and what that reveals to us about Western democracies and something called the Horseshoe Theory of Politics. So political parties or individuals are often visualized using two axes, one representing fiscal or economic policy, and the other representing social policy. Typically, the horizontal axis represents fiscal or economic policy, with the left side of the axis representing fiscally liberal positions, and the right side of the axis representing fiscally conservative positions or policies. And a simple way to think of this axis is that it represents financial independence. And independence, it can be a good thing or a bad thing. On one hand, independence can mean that you don't depend on the government, but on the other hand, it can mean that you can't depend on the government. So the left side of the axis represents higher taxes, more government regulations of businesses, but also more social programs and government subsidies. The right side of the axis represents lower taxes and less government regulations of businesses, but less social programs and less government subsidies. The vertical axis typically represents social policies, with the upper part being socially liberal policies and the lower part being more socially conservative policies. And an easy way to think of this axis is that it represents the government's leniency with regards to social norms, as in ideological or behavioral norms. So the lower part of the axis represents more government encouragement or enforcement of a specific set of social norms. And this could mean being tougher on crime, or more encouragement of a specific lifestyle or set of values or cultural norms. And the upper part of the axis represents less government encouragement and enforcements of these things. So it could be less tough on crime or less encouragement of a specific lifestyle or set of values. So any person or political party can qualitatively decide where they are on the axis of financial independence and where they are on the axes of leniency of social norms, and based on that align those positions and plot a point which represents generally their political views. Now, before we even plot a point, the axes themselves give us some information. And keep that in mind, the way you set up your axes already conveys information before a single point is plotted. People are usually first introduced to the two-dimensional plane with the x and y axes. And the positive x-axis, that's the right direction. The left direction is the negative x-axis. The upwards direction is the positive y-axis, and the downwards direction is the negative y-axis. And people usually associate the term positive with something good and the term negative with something bad. So setting up your axes in this way indirectly implies that the good region is this top right quadrant, and the bad region is this bottom left quadrant. Now, that top right quadrant, that represents more financial independence and more leniency towards social norms on our political spectrum here. In other words, less government influence and more individual liberties. This is often called a libertarian position. So a society that plots its political views on such a pair of axes, such as Western societies do, this is probably a society that values individual liberties and doesn't trust the government, which is also relatively true for Western democracies. Now, as for that lower left-hand quadrant, this one here, Well, that's negative on both the x and y axis, and politically it represents more government control over both economy and social norms. This quadrant represents a more authoritarian or totalitarian set of views, and a society that plots their political views in such a way is probably suspicious of too much government control, and that again is generally true for Western democracies. Now, what's interesting is that once we actually start plotting the positions of different political parties, we get something that more or less falls along a line. Okay, we get something that looks like this. Okay, something that stretches from the top left quadrant through the center or origin and into the bottom right quadrant. And it's interesting that despite an entire two-dimensional plane to work with, political views tend to fall along a single line. It's also interesting that despite the implication that people think of the top right quadrant as the most positive, there are not many people or parties that fall within this quadrant. Okay, libertarians certainly exist, but their political parties are not that big or mainstream. And libertarian-minded people often end up voting for either the major left-wing parties or the major right-wing parties or centrists. The fact that political parties do want to get elected and typically aren't libertarian suggests that there are not many libertarian voters. This apparent paradox can be explained from the perspective of survival. No matter how much freedom one wants, they still need to survive. They still need their basic needs met, like food and shelter. There are two ways to have your basic needs met. Either provide them for yourself or have someone else provide them for you. If the government provides the people with their basic needs, then the people are all set, and they can enjoy living their life as they please within the financial constraints of what the government provides. And this is considered the left-wing strategy. High taxes and regulations in exchange for more social programs and subsidies to take care of people, and more government leniency with regards to social norms. If, on the other hand, people prefer to provide for themselves instead of relying on the government, perhaps because they feel they can do a better job than the government, or they don't want to depend on the government, then that requires some work. They are going to need to have the right attitude for such success and to live in an environment where achieving such success is possible. People will also need to be able to work together with one another and trust each other. For example, no matter how business savvy one is, their store won't succeed if they're getting robbed every day, or if the employees clash with one another due to having different workplace ethics or disagreements as to what personal events justify being accommodated for in the workplace. In other words, for people to provide for themselves, they'll likely need the government to enforce social norms which allow and encourage individuals to successfully provide for them. That is the right-wing strategy. Lower taxes and less regulations in exchange for less social programs and less subsidies, plus sufficient encouragement or enforcement of social norms aimed to allow individuals to independently achieve success with the more money they have access to with lower taxes and the less regulations that they have to deal with. So there are two strategies, with each one offering some form of government control and some form of individual freedoms. And here we see how the libertarian strategy is a very difficult one. With minimal government regulation over finances and social norms, individuals would have to provide for themselves without a guarantee that they will be surrounded by conditions that allow for and encourage such individual success. Perhaps some people can accomplish that, but it is clear why many would find that too difficult and would hence prefer either a left-wing or a right-wing strategy. Now, there is a theory of politics called Horseshoe Theory. This theory states that the political spectrum is not a straight line, but a horseshoe shape. where the radical or far left and the radical or far right actually bend towards each other. In other words, the right-wing and left-wing radicals are actually more similar to each other than to the moderates on either side of the political spectrum. And if we plot this horseshoe shape on our two-dimensional space, we can actually see some insight as to why this theory makes sense. Horseshoe theory implies that the top left corners and the top and the bottom right corners are inaccessible. In some mathematical circles, people use the term unicorn zone to refer to regions of a graph that do not represent reality, and so no data points would be plotted there. It's the region where unicorns live. So why would these two corners be inaccessible? Well, the top left corner means the government has extreme control over the economy, but practically no control over social norms. And that's not realistic, because once the government obtains sufficient control over the economy, it can use that to influence social norms too. For example, by making it more expensive to spread some ideas while providing financial incentives to spread other ideas. And the more financial control the government gets beyond that, the more it would be able to influence social norms. As for the bottom right corner, it means that the government has extreme control over social norms and practically no control over the economy. This is not realistic either, because once they have sufficient control over social norms, that can be used to influence how people spend their money or what they can or can't spend money on, for example, by banning some goods or services. And the more control over social norms the government gets beyond that, well, the more it can influence the economy. Hence, the more one accelerates towards one of these two corners, the more they'll begin to curve and approach that bottom left-hand corner representing authoritarianism or totalitarianism. One might ask then, well, why doesn't the horseshoe bend the other way? Okay, why doesn't the horseshoe bend towards libertarianism? Okay, if the top left corner and the bottom right corner are inaccessible, well, why wouldn't approaching them cause a bend towards the top right? Part of the reason has to do with what we discussed before, that libertarianism is a difficult strategy that many would prefer to avoid and would rather give the government some more control over either the economy or social norms. The other reason has to do with the idea that those who have power do not want to give it up. Hence, a government approaching the top left corner or the bottom right corner would rather bend towards the bottom left than towards the top right. So, ironically, we have both the people and the government applying a force that moves society away from libertarianism and towards authoritarianism. This then begs another question. If such a force exists, then why aren't all countries authoritarian? Well, if you look at the entire world rather than just Western democracies, you see that authoritarianism is actually pretty common. Even totalitarianism is not that rare. The question then becomes, how is it that Western-style democracies can even exist? How is it that there can be such a stable, relatively moderate, left-wing, right-wing political spectrum, considering the natural push towards authoritarianism that exists? And once we understand that this is a relevant question, we begin to really appreciate how much of a rare miracle this political spectrum is. And perhaps, with that understanding, we can become more tolerant and appreciative of those with whom we may have different views but share the same political spectrum.